Bom, gente, então eu vou apresentar a Klara e a gente daí vai começar. Eu vou apresentá-la em português, depois em inglês, tá? E aí, para parte das questões, quem quiser fazer questões, pode fazer em português, coloca no chat por escrito, tá? Por favor, as questões em português. Quem quiser, que daí eu traduzo, eu traduzo para ela, tá? Agora sim, traduzir as respostas vai ser mais difícil, confunde um pouco, tá? Mas as questões eu posso traduzir, tá? Então a gente vai começar oficialmente agora, tá bom? Well, we are now beginning the last day of our event. Today we are gonna this morning. We are receiving the historian Klara Naskowska, who is going to give a lecture about the history of the Jewish New Women, mental health professionals between Poland, the Nazis, and America. And Klara, she's a PhD, she's a Polish Jewish research scholar, educator, writer, and organizer. She's a Fulbright Award recipient and also the founding director of the International Association for Spiritual Studies. Naskowska is a cultural and personal historian of Jewish women, psychoanalysts, and other mental health professionals with research interests in gender, oral history, immigration, and memory. She is currently researching and writing her rehabilitation book at Columbia University. Columbia University's Herman Institute under the working title Jewish Female Mental Health Professionals Between Poland, Nazis, and the United States, Memory, History, and Interpretation. So welcome, Klara. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's very good to have you here today. Just, I mean, before you begin, I just would like to present you in Portuguese for the people of Brazil. It's more easier for them to understand who you are. Então, gente, a Klara Naskowska, ela é uma pesquisadora, né? Ela é polonesa, judia, ela é uma educadora, uma escritora, uma organizadora, e entre as principais organizações recentes, ela fundou, então, a Associação Internacional para Estudos sobre Sabina Spielrein, né? Ela atualmente recebeu um prêmio Fulbright, uma bolsa de pesquisa, né? Um prêmio para pesquisa. Ela é uma historiadora da cultura e uma historiadora pessoal, história de pessoas, né? Pesquisando principalmente sobre mulheres judias, psicanalistas e outros profissionais de saúde mental. E os interesses de pesquisa dela se concentram, então, em gênero, história oral, imigração e memória, né? E atualmente ela está pesquisando e escrevendo um livro nessa bolsa que ela tem na Columbia University, no Instituto Herman da Columbia University, que tem então esse título provisório de mulheres judias profissionais de saúde mental entre a Polônia, os nazistas e os Estados Unidos, memória, história e interpretação. É sobre esse assunto que ela vai falar hoje com a gente, ok? Então, como combinado, vocês, por favor, façam as questões, quem quiser fazer em português, quem quiser fazer a questão em inglês, simplesmente levanta a mãozinha aí do Zoom, tá? E a gente vai passando a palavra. Quem quiser fazer a questão em português, escreve no chat, e daí eu leio depois, eu traduzo e passo para Klara, ok? Ok, gente. I believe now we can begin. Klara, once more, welcome, and thanks for your lecture. And you have the word.
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, Richard and Fátima, for inviting me to talk about my research. It's a pleasure. I also want to say that so I will be speaking in English, but if you need me to take breaks to translate something, or if anything comes up, just interrupt me, just feel free to stop me, and we can do that if that's needed. So I would like to start by briefly introducing this research that I have been doing. I started this in April 2020, which was the worst month of a pandemic here in New York. And I was stuck at home, and I just started thinking about some form of a destruction, I would say. And I remembered then that I read once when I was working on my previous project already here in New York, that I read that there were 18 women psychoanalysts who immigrated to the United States in 1930s and 1940s, fleeing Hitler. And I thought that, knowing what I already knew about the first women psychoanalysts, that number has to be way too low. And that was my pandemic project in a way. That was initially a way to, in a way, even calm me down, was to make a list of names. So I started researching, reading everything that I could, all the list of passengers who arrived in New York, memoirs, all the documents that I could get my hands on. At that time, it was quite limited because everything was closed. But anyway, I started putting together this list of names, thinking that 18, that could not be a true number. And right now I have 87. So this project grew to something enormous, but also showed me something that I think I felt before, but it really proved to me that if there are only 18 names remembered, and then even when I give lectures and when I talk to people and when I teach, I usually ask people, how many names do you remember? And it's usually much less than 18. It's usually 2, 3, 5 names maybe of women psychoanalysts who immigrated to the US at that time. But there were actually at least 87, because I'm pretty sure that there are a few more that were so forgotten, so left out of the recorded past, that I haven't yet come across them, their names even, and I might never will. So that was the beginning, and then so I divided those 87 into different groups to approach them from different angles. So one way of dividing them was into generations. So for me, well, you can divide psychoanalysts into generations based on different aspects. I divided them. For me, the first generation of those women were those who were born in 1870s and 1880s. And out of the 87, there were only 11 that were part of that generation. The second generation for me were those born in 1890s through 1910s. And that was the remaining 76. Then out of, so I'm a Jewish women's historian. So that's also why I've always been interested in psychoanalysis. So out of those 87, at least 83 were Jewish, with both parents being Jewish. I don't know for sure about the remaining 4. There could have even been more, but at least 83 were Jewish. Almost all of those families were culturally and socially assimilated, and only a few of the parents out of the 83 Jewish women were observant to any degree. They were usually non-observant, and they usually had a cultural Jewish identity. So they would follow some rituals and customs, but it was a cultural identity. So then when this group started growing and growing, I started to realize that I need to split this project into smaller projects because, I wanted to write a book about those women. And I realized, well, no one's going to read a book about 87 women. And I'll be writing this book for 20 years. So the group I took out of it were the Polish Jewish women. I'm Polish, and I have a master's degree in Polish studies. So this was something that was quite natural for me to follow, but also Polish women were the largest national group in out of those 87. There were more Polish women, there were 22 in those 87, and more than Austrian or German women, which was quite puzzling and interesting to me, given the fact that, Austria and Germany, Vienna and Berlin were the two main centers of psychoanalysis in pre-war Europe. But actually the Polish women were the largest national group. So there are 22 Poles, 21 Austrians and 20 Germans. So that was very close, but still the Polish were the largest group. And that was interesting to me. So I was asking myself, why? Like, how did that happen? And then also, when I say Polish, I'm talking about women who were born in non-existent Poland. Poland was then partitioned. It was split between three empires, starting in 1772 for 123 years, up until the end of First World War, 1918. Poland did not exist. It was split between Russia, Prussia, or Germany, and the Habsburg Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I was interested in why there were so many Poles among them, and I'm also interested in identities. I was also interested in all the complex, all the components of those women's identities, and I found that component of being born in non-existent country. The reason why I say that they were Polish was not only that they were born on a Polish territory, but because they identified as Poles. Polish was their first language. It was the first language of their parents, the first language spoken in the family home, very often together with Yiddish, and it was or like a mix, but they identified as Poles. So I was interested in that mix of identities. So already when they were born, they had a Polish identity, they had a Jewish identity, and then they had, a citizenship of either Austria, Russia, or Germany, which was another component. And then I found out that they were a very special group of so-called new women who not only pursued academic education and professional careers in fields that were typically male at that time, and not only entered the psychoanalytic circles at that time when they were still very much dominated by men, but they also did this after traveling. They would have to move out of their family home and move out of the Polish territory, or sometimes it was again, independent Poland, it was after 1918, and travel usually by themselves to Austria or Germany to study, and then to join the psychoanalytic movements there. So I was that's a very brief background to my study. So, like what Richard said, now what I'm doing is I'm working on those 22 women. I've published several papers about non-Poles out of this enormous group of 87, but now I'm focused on the Polish ones, and that's what I'm working on, and that's the book I'm one of two books actually that I'm currently writing and still researching, but also writing. So what I want to do today is I would like to talk to you about one of the women specifically, Judith Kestenberg, a Polish Jewish woman, because she's a typical example and a non-typical example at the same time. And I think that's interesting too, instead of telling you about all the 22 women and giving you a lot of names and dates, I think that'd be more interesting to hear her story, because her, for example, family educational backgrounds are very typical. Her career path, her education are very typical for not only the 22 Polish Jewish women psychoanalysts, but for the whole group of 87. But at the same time, some of her choices and her religious upbringing are very unusual. And then something that I'm very interested in, which is the relationship those women had with their pasts and with the traumas and with the losses they endured before the war in Nazi Europe, then during the war, during the Holocaust. Her approach to her past and what happened to her parents, I will tell you more about that, was very unusual, because usually almost all of those women that I have researched so far, sorry, my something fell, was to forget. Well, that was prescribed approach of mental health professionals at that time, to forget the past, to move on, especially to the emigres, to the new world, to America. You have a new life, you can just move on, don't talk about this, don't dig in the past, just move on. So I will get into this in a moment. So I'm going to start with her familiar and religious background. So Judith Kestenberg, she was born as Judita Hadassah Silberpfennig in 1910. So she is a representative of the second generation, but also born pretty late among that group, 1910. She was born in her grandmother's house, which was a tradition at her mother that would deliver all of her free children at her mother's home in Krakow. Krakow is today's Kraków in Poland, the second largest city in Poland, but that was during the partition times that I've mentioned before. And so Krakow was in the Habsburg Empire at that time, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that region was called Austrian Galicia or Galicia, sometimes we'll call it Polish Galicia. So Judith Kestenberg's parents, Sarah and Shaya, both came from very wealthy Jewish bourgeoisie families. And that was a very typical background for those women. She had two older siblings, Henry and Helen. And they lived in Tarnow, which was a smaller town, also in the Austrian Galicia, in this Poland occupied by Habsburg Empire. In Tarnow, Jews before the Shoah comprised about half of the population. So it was one of those towns or cities which had a very large Jewish community before the war. So she was, in a way, like I said before, a typical new woman. And a new woman is someone who had a university education in the early 20th century and who defied conventional expectations by seeking personal fulfillment through higher education and a career in those fields that were traditionally male. And those women typically came from upper middle class families or intellectual bourgeoisie, sometimes from merchant class families, and almost all of those families were wealthy, very wealthy, or extremely wealthy. When she was born in 1910, her family was very well off. Her father was an industrialist and a businessman who invested in many small businesses, and he made a fortune out of it. They lived in one of the most beautiful buildings in Tarnow, or Tarnów, as we call it today. The house was filled with paintings of renowned artists. They had servants. They had an automobile, which was very unusual in 1910. They traveled frequently. They spent summers in spa resorts, luxury hotels, and so on and so on. Her father was also a general's philanthropist. And after the First World War, he established a small orphanage for toddlers. And her mother would, with Judith, would visit that orphanage at least once a week to help out there. That is something that Judith herself said was, in a way, a beginning of her interest in helping people, in helping young patients. But in the mid-1920, after a series of very bad financial decisions, her father lost almost all of his family's wealth. They had to sell a lot of things that they had, including some properties, and they were left with almost nothing, according to her sister Helen, which I am, to be honest, not sure what it means, almost nothing. Probably for very rich people, it means something different. It would mean for me, but it did impact their life choices and their future decisions for sure. So usually, like I mentioned before, parents of new women were either non-observant or observed only some of the Jewish holidays and had mainly a cultural Jewish identity. But so here's the difference with Kestenberg. Her parents were very Orthodox Jews. They had a kosher home. They observed all of the Jewish customs, rituals, and holidays. And Shaya was a very well-known public figure in the town, and he was an important member of the Jewish community. And his involvement with the Jewish orphanage is also part of that involvement with the Jewish community. So as a consequence, atypically, Judith's early education was different from the education received by those Jewish future psychoanalysts and other mental health professionals who came from non-Orthodox homes, because her early education actually focused on religion, Jewish religion, culture, and tradition. So she started her education with a private teacher, which was typical, but her private teacher was a Hebrew teacher. And the Hebrew alphabet was actually the first alphabet she learned. The Bible was the first book she ever read. And then the second one was a prayer book. And so that was her first education was in the cultural, social, and religious aspects of Judaism. And that the importance of her having been raised in an Orthodox family, a family that had a very strong Jewish identity, was sorry, let me start over. It really impacted her later educational and professional choices. So, including, I would argue, her choice to, like I mentioned, differently from almost all of the other Jewish female psychoanalysts who immigrated to the US to actually try to reconnect with her Jewish, with the past, which was dictated by the fact that her parents were Jewish. So it seems that her upbringing, the Orthodox upbringing, encouraged her to pursue university-level education and a professional career. So parents of Jewish women psychoanalysts of that second generation, especially because the first generation, those born in 1870s, 1880s, that was a different case usually. But the parents of Jewish women psychoanalysts of the second generation, Orthodox and non-Orthodox, they usually did support their daughters in pursuing academic education and professional careers. They usually supported them financially and morally, especially fathers. The mothers are usually didn't really speak up about that issue. Well, we could talk about why there were so many Jewish women among the first new women, so the first women who pursued university education. There are definitely many reasons behind that. One was that many of those Jewish families were, like I mentioned, very wealthy, so they could afford that. They didn't have to marry their daughters into wealth. They didn't have to worry about that at all. I think the fact that the fathers were usually very well educated and they knew the value of education, they wanted this for their daughters. There were all the emancipatory movements at that time happening too, and Jews were well, these are just pointers and generalizations, but Jews were very active in those movements. Another thing is that education has always been of special value to Jews. And one reason behind it, I would say, is that educating children would mean giving them something that could not be taken away from them, as opposed to their life, their possessions, their citizenship, and so on and so on. So that was informed by the Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism persecution. So this is true for, again, a generalization, but this is true for the vast majority of the Jewish first women psychoanalysts, that their families supported them in pursuing university level education. But in Orthodox families, there was this additional, or still is, this additional custom that women were actually expected to work and provide for the family, in part because that would allow the men to have more time to study the Talmud and pray. So that was something that was expected, that women help out financially so that men have more time. But there is also a difference in the Kestenberg family, or Silberfenning actually family, was that her mother, so usually the mothers, like I said, were not vocal about their daughters' education. It was the fathers who would make the decisions and decide to support them financially, support them morally. The father's moral support meant that, yes, she could go on and get an education and have a career. But here, Sarah Silberfenning, who was Judith Kestenberg's mother, also supported both her daughters, Judith and her older sister Helen, who I'm going to mention briefly later, because she also had an amazing career, in attending university, in having a career, because Sarah was exceptionally intelligent and she had a huge thirst for knowledge. She attended University of Krakow courses, or Krakow, in secret before her marriage. That was absolutely forbidden. She spoke 6 languages fluently. She read modern Hebrew poetry. She played the piano. And then when the family finances starting to crumble, she started to study economics in private lessons to help out with the finances. And then several years later, when the family lived in Vienna already, she took that opportunity and she started to audit political science courses at the University of Vienna. She was 36 at that time, but I'll get to that chapter later. So until 3rd grade, Judith had that private tutor, a private Hebrew teacher. And then she was enrolled in the girls' gymnasium in Tarnów. A gymnasium was an 8-year secondary school that provided college-level education, including Latin and Greek, and was really almost the only path to a university. It was very hard to get to the university, to enroll and get accepted without finishing a gymnasium and without graduating with a diploma, which was called an abitur or matura. But then Judith's older brother, Henry, graduated from a gymnasium in 1923, and and he was gay, and that was a scandal in that quite small town of Tarnow. So the family decided that he has to move to Vienna to study in Vienna, and he started studying political science at the law department at the University of Vienna, and the women of the family went with him. So Judith, her older sister Helen, and her mother Sarah, and that's where Sarah also joined in and audited the courses with her son. Kestenberg in Vienna continued at a gymnasium. She went to a private, as she calls it, socialist gymnasium in a working class district of Ottakrik. That was not a coincidence. Her father was a socialist, and she was also to become a socialist herself. After her graduation, she enrolled in the medical school at the University of Vienna. She was a foreigner at that time because Poland regained independence in 1918. So her Austrian citizenship was taken away from her, and now she was a Polish citizen. And as a foreigner, she was expected to pay 3 times the tuition that Austrians were charged. And at that time already, her family could not afford that at all. And but she figured it out. She applied for a reduction, and then she secured it. So she was able to start studying. And to study medicine was a typical choice for Jewish women, and especially Orthodox, especially daughters of Orthodox Jews, who typically pursued education in professions that were viewed as practical, so professions that could easily lead to a job, basically, that could that would allow to provide for a family. And medicine was, of course, one of those professions. And so just super quick note that as soon as the Austrian medical school started to accept women in 1900, Jewish women came to make up a very high proportion of students, of the first female students there. So out of the first 18 women who received medical degrees in 1906, 2/3 were Jewish. Also, in choosing medicine, Judith was striving for financial independence. And so she, as she wrote, "I knew that because of our poor economic situation, I had to choose a subject that could sustain me and maybe the family. I definitely had to stand on my own 2 feet." End of quote, which I think shows that she was brought up to be someone very independent. So she started to study medicine in 1928, and she graduated in 1934 with a degree in psychiatry. After graduating as a doctor, I'm skipping this part because we don't really know much about her studies. But after graduating as a doctor, she began training at the neurology and psychiatry clinic at the university. So that was 1934. And at that time, Austrian neuroscience, well, Austrian medicine, but Austrian neuroscience especially, was already infested with racism, eugenics, and anti-Semitism. And the process of so-called de-Judification of Austro-German medicine, a field that was prevalently Jewish, led to a dismissal of many, again, non-Aryan neuroscientists and who were then replaced by political appointees who adhere to the National Socialist principles and who were very often underqualified. So since 1928, which I don't know about how you feel about this, the first time I read about this, I was, to be honest, very shocked that it was so early. So 1928, a new head of that clinic, neurology and psychiatry clinic, was appointed. His name was Otto Potzel, and he was an early National Socialist Party member. His assistant, Alfred Ausberg, was a fanatic Nazi. And many doctors, I'm not going to list here because time is limited, were also Nazis. And so Kestenberg there at the clinic, she worked with all of them, and especially with Walter Birkmeyer, who was also a very devoted and very active Nazi. They collaborated, and they even wrote an article, a report together on their discovery of this rare tumor. So before the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria to Nazi Germany in March 1938, membership in Nazi National Socialist parties was illegal in Austria. That was forbidden in Austria. So as a rule, those Austrian doctors who were Nazis were not open about this because that was a risk to their careers. But nonetheless, it seems from what I've read so far and what I've researched so far, that their political affiliations were known at the clinic that Kestenberg worked, were commonly known in that clinic. However, Kestenberg claimed that she was unaware of it. I'm going to quote several of her statements. She said, for example, "My best friends in the neurology department were Nazis, but I didn't know it. I was so naive that I, unlike everyone else at the clinic, did not know that Birkmeyer and Ausberg were Nazis." And then she says also, "My analyst," that was after she immigrated to the US, she had Hermann Nunberg was her analyst. She says, "My analyst pointed it out to me, but I didn't really believe it until 1938 when Birkmeyer sent me our report." So that was this report on this discovery of this rare tumor. Birkmeyer sent it to her in 1938. She was already in New York. And he added this note in which he said, "Oh, I wish you were here. And I wish you could see the amazing things happening in Germany and Austria." So to me, those statements, and some of them she made at the age of 90, shortly before her death. So throughout her life, she made similar statements, which suggest a high level of disassociation, maybe even denial about that chapter of her life and about who her friends then were. So, but at the same time as she was training there, she was also training at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute from 1934, so the same year up until her immigration in 1937. And of course, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute was predominantly Jewish. So now about her immigration. So typically, those who were in Vienna, intellectuals, mental health professionals, including psychoanalysts, up until the Anschluss, so March 1938, they had this idea that they are more or less safe, that despite everything that was going on in Germany, despite Hitler becoming chancellor in 1933, and then everything else that was happening, all the anti-Semitic campaigns, the violence and everything else, they still had that feeling that German fascism would be short-lived, and they felt comparatively safe in Austria. I think an important factor to why they felt that is that they were immersed in German language culture, arts, scientists, philosophy, and so on and so on. And they separated, they couldn't believe that this nation that was responsible for all those cultural achievements could also be doing what they were doing. And they believe that this is just episodic, the anti-Semitic violence is just episodes, and that the rubble is responsible, and that this will soon end, because it couldn't be long-lived, because it couldn't be supported. So as a result, the large majority of them didn't immigrate from Austria after up until the Anschluss. And then there was a huge wave right after Anschluss. So like even March, but April, May, mostly April, May 1938, that was a huge immigration wave from Austria. Kestenberg, unusually again, left earlier. She left in July 1937. So before this peak of immigration. And she, throughout her life, claimed that she left for merely professional reasons, that she wanted to continue her psychoanalytic training in New York with a specific psychoanalyst that she never worked with, actually, but that's what she said. And also that she, and that's definitely true, that she struggled, that she didn't have many career perspectives in Europe. So she tried to validate her medical degree in Poland, and she was affected by the numerus clausus, and she couldn't do that. In Austria, as a foreigner, she also struggled with finding a job. So that was definitely true. I do find it, though, I would say, interesting how much she insisted on that fact, that her decision was her own, and her decision was dictated by her, by professional reasons only. So, for example, because, you know, the truth was that in Austria, even before the Anschluss, she was in danger because she was a Jew, because she was a psychoanalyst, and because she was an active socialist. So that was like a triple danger. Still, in an interview from 1991, she was then 81 years old. She would really abruptly separate herself from that. And she would say, for example, I did not flee the Nazis. I left Vienna to continue my training in New York, period. So I'm aware that I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to skip a little bit here. So when she got to New York, she continued her training as a psychoanalyst, and then she also passed a medical examination that was required of foreigners in the US to practice as doctors. But as this happened, she, basically, as soon as she did pass this exam in 1938, she had to put all of her training and her career aside, because she focused on getting her family out of Europe. And she managed to help her brother Henry to get him out. She managed to secure funds for that, and he got out. He ended up in Cuba. Her sister Helen left on her own in March 1939. And so a quick note that I promised, she is now called the First Lady of American Law because she became the first female professor of law in the United States. It's also just an amazing story. But anyway, so, but her parents were still back in Europe, and she initially assumed that her father will be fine. So she was trying to help her mother get out of Europe. Her mother fled to the east when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and she was in Stanislavov, which is now Ivano-Frankivsk in Ukraine, again filled with refugees of the war going on in Ukraine. Judith pleaded with the US State Department. She was trying to persuade them to help get her mother out of Poland, but it didn't happen. And then when Stanisław was taken by the Germans in July 1941, the correspondence between Judith and her mother ended abruptly. And until today, we don't know when exactly her mother, Sarah, was killed. It was definitely 1941, but there were so many massacres in that area that we don't know in which one she was murdered, which is something that was very upsetting to Judith. It remained very upsetting, the fact that she didn't know when her mother died, where is she buried, if she even is actually buried, what happened with her body, and so on. Her father was in their hometown of Tarnów when the war broke. He was imprisoned in the ghetto there that was established there in Tarnów. And then he was deported to Auschwitz and murdered in Auschwitz. And we know when he was exactly murdered, that was December 23rd, 1941, because some prisoners kept completely, of course, secret records of those being murdered. So we know that. So the correspondence with her parents suddenly ended in 1941. She was corresponding with both of them. And when this happened, she didn't know what happened with her parents. She just went back to work, trying to forget, trying to busy herself with work. She graduated from the New York Psychoanalytic Institute in 1943. She became a training analyst. She was seeing patients. She worked in many hospitals in New York. She got married in 1944. And then she also had children. In 1946, so 5 years later, almost 5 years later, a list of those who survived Nazi tyranny was published, and her parents' names was not on it. So that's when it was confirmed to her. It was conclusive that her parents did not survive the Holocaust. And she became very depressed, and she felt very guilty, which was very typical for those who survived, to feel guilty if their parents or siblings or grandparents were left behind. And she wrote, "I was able to function by stepping back into what seemed like a period of latency in my life. It served as a distancing maneuver from the trauma that could not be averted." So that period of latency lasted for a very long time. It lasted for 22 years. So for 22 years, she just separated herself. It seems like she separated herself entirely from everything that had to do with the Holocaust, with Poland, with the Nazis. She didn't want to hear anything. When her sister-in-law wanted to talk, and remember, she was a psychoanalyst, she was a mental health professional. So when her sister-in-law Irene wanted to talk to her about her parents who were murdered in a death camp in Treblinka, Kesterberg would say, "I don't want to hear anything." She would just leave the room. This is, of course, reportedly what people remember, people I talked to remembered about her. She didn't look into how or where or when exactly her parents were killed. She just worked. She raised two children, Janet, who was born in 1946, and she also adopted a son, Howard. She was 46 when she adopted him in 1956. But then in the late 1950s, her husband, who was a lawyer and who was representing survivors of Nazi persecution, discovered that German psychiatrists and legal experts who were speaking in court were not acknowledging any psychological damage that was suffered by those victims, those survivors of the Holocaust, who were very young, were either born during the war or very young children during the war, saying that, well, they don't remember, they were too young to remember, they were too young to be traumatized, or they were too resilient. That was actually an argument too. And Milton, Judith's husband, thought, and because of this, they were refusing any form of compensation. So Milton started to work with his clients in a way as a psychologist and just talking to them, trying to help them remember so that they could say, no, actually, I remember those things that happened to me. And then in 1968, so 22 years after she discovered about her parents' death, Judith woke up from that period of silence and she started working with her husband. I'm going to stop for a second. How much time do I have to talk? So I need, so I know what to skip.
Oh, you're okay. You can take your time. You have.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to check. I wasn't sure what time was.
Not in a hurry right now.
Okay, great. So she woke up from that latency period in 1968 when she was treating a patient, and she suddenly discovered that this patient was a child of a Holocaust survivor. So this was someone born after the war, to a Holocaust survivor. And this patient, I'm going to quote here from the case file, behaved very strangely. He did not eat any food, hid in forests, and treated Judith as a hostile persecutor. He was emaciated and hollow-eyed, end of quote. And with this case, she became interested in this transgenerational transmission of trauma from the parent who survived the persecution to a child. And she called those children of survivors. That's a term she used for them. So those are those who were born after the period of persecution or who were born during the period of persecution, but in complete safety. And so when she started working in that field, she plunged into it completely. She became, even according to some of her coworkers, obsessive. So from complete rejection, she went into this obsessive interest in the Holocaust, in those survivors. And she discovered quickly that, again, quote from Kestenberg, the cure-all was to forget the past and to build the future. There was a prohibition against discussing the past. One can even say that most of these child survivors received counter support from the mental health professionals. So that's something I mentioned before. It was this idea, just don't talk about this, just move on. But she disagreed with this, and this is highly unusual. And this led to her really starting a new field of study. It's probably natural for us. We know that we should talk about this, but up until 1960s, the Eichmann trial in 61, 62, that was this first event that kind of started to open up this new field of talking about the past at all. But it was in a way shocking to think that mental health professionals actually encourage their patient to not talk about it. So she was really one of the very first who said, no, you have to talk about that. So she set up, what she did, I'm not going to name all the groups, all the organizations that she set up, and that's actually something that's you can Google that. That is there, that is available. But she started setting up study groups for children of survivors. She started with her husband. A lot of this work was done, they did together as this team of psychologist, psychoanalyst, and lawyer. And the group of colleagues working with her was growing. So a lot of this work, she was a leader, but her colleagues did a lot of work. It wasn't just her, it was a team of people working together. And then she had another case, and that was a boy who was born in a ghetto, and then he was deported to a concentration camp at the age of 2. And survivors like this, she called child survivors. So there were those who actually experienced the Nazi persecution as young children. So she continued to reach out to colleagues around the world. She traveled a lot, and every time, according to her daughter, even if she traveled for fun, even if it was a holiday, she would still meet up with people, interview people. She was talking to her colleagues, and she was surprised that she wrote this survey initially asking colleagues around the world, do you have any cases like this? And she was shocked that her colleagues were mostly uninterested in that issue. But she continued to reach out to them. She was looking for adolescents. She was looking for patients. And she opened up, like I said, that was an entirely new field of dealing with those child survivors. So those who were born or very young during persecution. I just want to name 2 more pioneers who were also in that field so that they're not skipped. That was Henry Crystal and William Nederland, who I think are much better known for this work, their work on trauma. But for the most part, symptoms exhibited by Holocaust survivors were ignored. It was sometimes diagnosed as paranoia. And then in 1972, she founded this big organization that was devoted to mental health of children. It was called Child Development Research, and she was a director of it. And then, like I said, many more projects, many more organizations followed. So according to one of her close friends that I talked to, her main motive behind her initiative was always, quote, primary prevention. And again, quote, she was always trying to prevent another Holocaust. Through her untiring pursuit of the roots of hate and prejudice, she sought to lay the basis of prevention of a recurrence of racism leading to genocide. End of quote. In 1981, she initiated something that was called the International Study of Organized Persecution of Children. And so she put together that was with her husband, the 2 of them, Judith and Milton Kestenberg. They put together a group of about a dozen mental health professionals who were locating child survivors around the world, conducting interviews and providing psychological support. And they collected 1,500 testimonies, around 1,500 testimonies from children 13 and younger. That was the age group, primarily from Jewish survivors, but also from Polish survivors, German survivors, and some of them whose parents were Nazis as well. And most of those interviewees spoke for the very first time about their wartime experiences. A quick note on the method that was her method, the method that was employed by all of those interviewers was to not interrupt, to let the survivors speak spontaneously, to allow them to develop a narrative that could help integrate different identities of those child survivors. So identities of a victim, identity of a survivor, and into the whole identity of a human being, because there was usually a gap in their story, the gap where the Holocaust was, where the trauma was. So the idea was that if they talk without interruptions, that would help them gain continuance of that story and integrate all of those identities into one identity. Don't feel just like a victim, just like a survivor, but a whole person. So one of the conclusions she arrived at, which I found very interesting, is that those she talked to were very eager to talk about their traumatic memories, traumatic, painful experiences, but they needed something that she called the permission to remember the past. And she was giving them that permission. So this therapist, or because there are many different types of therapists, not only psychoanalysts in that group interviewing survivors, they were given that permission to talk about the past. So while working with these survivors in this process of remembering, she began to build a bridge between her own past, so her upbringing, religious and cultural Jewish upbringing, the deaths of her parents in the Holocaust, the impact of German fascism on her life and her current work with the survivors. However, her personal papers, the interviews with her and her memoir, they're filled with themes from her work. But she really mentions her own life, her own losses in passing and very sporadically. And same with, I talked to a lot of people who knew her very well for years and years, worked with her children as well. That's their take too, that she didn't want to talk throughout her life, didn't want to talk about her experiences as a Jewish woman in occupied Europe, as an immigrant, isolated and struggling with a lot of things, about this guilt of being a survivor while her parents were victims, a trauma survivor. So she didn't talk about this with her family, with her friends, with her colleagues. She avoided the subject. She didn't want to talk about the depression. We know that she was depressed, and she was in therapy several times with different therapists, but she didn't talk about being depressed. So also it's quite obvious when you read interviews with her or even her memoir that when she is asked or she approaches the question, anything connected with the Holocaust, she initially hesitates, she tries to avoid the question. And then when pushed or makes this decision, I guess, to address it, she used very vile language, like she's kind of protective of her past. Even after this wake up in 1968, especially about her parents' death. So I came to the conclusion that she never fully embraced. She tried talking about, she did take some attempts, she makes some attempts at talking the losses and traumas that she had endured, but she didn't fully embrace them. So one very rare example of her opening up about the pain of her parents' death was when she was discussing the importance of knowing when your relatives' remains are, where they are buried and what happened to them. So she wrote, quote, and that's a very rare example, quote, "The Holocaust brutally stole my parents from me. There was nothing left of my father by a pile of ashes. I don't know if and where my mother is buried. I don't know what happened in that little town of Stanisławów." That's where her mother was murdered. So it was not until 1988 or 89 that she said the first Kaddish for her parents during Yom Kippur. That's a prayer for the dead. And then one very close friend of hers said that in the 2 decades of their friendship and professional relationship, quote, they had never had a personal they had never had a personal conversation about the Holocaust, and that Kestenberg never, quote, shared anything about herself or the loss of her parents, end of quote. Another one of her colleagues interpreted that in the following way. He said, Kestenberg didn't talk directly about her losses and traumas, but they showed in her method of interviewing She was extremely sensitive, empathic, attuned to her interviewees, end of quote. So it does seem, and that's, I arrived at a similar conclusion, that it does seem that she channeled her personal experiences into her work. So also, she was something I mentioned before, according to almost all of her close friends and colleagues, she was a workaholic. She always planned her personal life around her work. Her daughter, Janet, said that she was absolutely obsessed with her work with survivors, that she only read books and only watched films on the subject of the Holocaust, that all of her birthdays served as fundraisers for the survivors, that even when she traveled, she interviewed, even if she traveled for pleasure, she interviewed survivors wherever she went, and that she was compulsive and obsessed with Auschwitz, that she made this map where her father was killed. She made this map of each bunk in each block with the whole story behind it. So a quick note at the for the conclusion about her Jewish identity, because I mentioned toward the beginning that I think that the fact that she was, well, it's a speculation, but I would say an informed speculation, given my research on the other Jewish women who were raised by non-Orthodox families, would be that this fact that her parents were Orthodox and the fact that they had a very strong Jewish identity, that was their primary identity, and that her first education was in Jewish culture, Jewish traditions, and Judaism, might have an impact on the fact that she stands out. Like, out of those 87 women, there was only one more who dealt with the Holocaust in her work. So, who actually was also raised by Orthodox parents and who also was Polish. That was Alberta Sharita, also a fascinating figure, but part of our book too. If I can plug the book at the end, that'd be great. Anyway, so I think that the fact that she was brought up in that Orthodox way might have an impact on the fact that she worked with the Holocaust victims and the Holocaust survivors, and she devoted her life to it after this waking up, after 2 years of silence. And so at the end, I want to say that she preserved that Jewish identity, again, very differently from almost all the other women I've been researching. So even those who were brought up with some form of Jewish identity, usually cultural, it was kind of like a family identity, then they would usually shed it in immigration. They were often, well, they were completely non-religious, and also would very rarely follow any customs, Jewish customs, Jewish rituals. Kestenberg, differently, at the age of 85, in one of the interviews, she said, "My Jewish identity is very strong." And that statement is confirmed many times in other personal history materials, in the interviews I conducted, and in her work. It's hard to assess if her Jewish identity was cultural, historical, familiar, or religious, because here, that's interesting. I'm not going to get into it because I don't think, although I maybe super quickly, when I talk to her children who are very different, they see it differently too. So it mostly seems that it was a cultural identity, that it was important to her that the Jewish customs, the traditions, the holidays, they brought the family together. That was the most important part. But according to her son, Howard, it was not. But Howard, I should say, he's a member of the Hasidic Chabad movement. he said, no, she was religious in her own way. She was always Jewish. It was inside of her. She lived it. It was who she was. So he disagrees. He sees this as also a religious identity. So there is, we can see that her, she does start to embrace her multicultural, multinational identity, her Jewish identity, including her Jewish identity and her Polish identity after her awakening. But I think she continues to avoid the question about her identity and because it's connected so much with her past. And then, so when she was asked, where are you from? She would say, New York. And when she was asked about her identity, she would say Polish, Jewish, and American. And when she was asked, where do you feel you belong, in the American tradition or the European, she would say, and I think that proves that she was strong-minded and assertive, which we know she was, but I think it also proves that she continued to avoid the question. So she would say, I belong to myself. And that's where I can end. Thank you.
Thank you, Klara. This was an amazing lecture. Thank you very much. It's really unbelievable that there are so many important people in the history of psychoanalysis we never heard about. If those people are rarely mentioned in the United States, you can imagine here in Brazil, so far away, they are almost completely unknown. Even Judith Kesterman is not the less unknown of them, because she has a huge output, publications, and so. Mm-hmm. But even she, for me, until recently, it was just a name, a little more than that. So thank you very much. I have a ton of questions to make, but I'm going to Fátima wants to make some comments or questions for you. Then I'm going to open to our public, and then if we have time, I'd like to ask or comment one thing or two. Thank you very much. Fátima, do you want to?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Klara, for this illuminating lecture and for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to learn more about your work. I believe that your research is very important, not only for the history of psychoanalysis, psychology, but also to understand the personal experience of women at that time, and to understand the experience of being displaced, which is very relevant these days. You are bringing to light many forgotten or unknown psychoanalysts and mental health professionals. And it's interesting that many of them made original theoretical and clinical contributions. I found Judith Kestenberg particularly fascinating. In Brazil, there are many people studying history of psychoanalytic ideas and epistemology of psychoanalysis, but many times the importance of the contextual characteristics is underestimated. So I believe that your work is a great contribution to this field. I would like to ask, what, in your opinion, determined who was forgotten and who is remembered in the history of psychoanalysis? why some brilliant psychoanalysts was forgotten, while others became well-known and entered into the history of psychoanalysis, many times having their importance overestimated. And you comment that the vast majority of these psychoanalysts who fled Nazi Europe tried to disconnect from their past. Judith Kestenberg was an exception. Do you think that it was a characteristic of this specific group of Nazi refugees, or do you think that it was a characteristic of Nazi refugees in general?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I think these are two questions, and they're both really great. So I think there are a number of reasons why some, well, we're talking about women, right? You're asking about women, where some women are remembered. We're not even talking about men, right? Because men are remembered because they're men. Like, that's simple. And I'm not going to get into this, but about women, why some women are remembered and some are not. I think, of course, in cases, there are many different cases, or like groups of cases, let's say. But I think, so one thing you've mentioned, I mean, Richard mentioned that Kestenberg, he knows Kestenberg because of her publications. So that's something that helps a lot. So if those women published, then, you know, they left this trace, and we come across their names because there are those publications. You start researching some subject in psychoanalysis, and, oh, she wrote about that. Some of those women, the 87 from my group, because these are the ones I can talk about. You know, I can't really talk about, although there are a lot of similarities between those immigrants to US and immigrants to UK and so on. But I will be talking about this field that I know most about. So some of those women didn't publish at all because, you know, they focused on working with patients, for example. And if that was the case, they're usually in this group that is completely forgotten because there are no publications, and their work with patients that is protected. We by law, we don't have access to case studies unless they publish them, like the one that I read from Kestenberg. But if it's just patient files, we don't have access to this, so they disappear. Those who held important positions, like Helene Deutsch, that's probably a name that a lot of you might know because she was the first director of the Training Institute in Vienna, and then when she moved to Boston, you know, she was this, I'm going to use a term I don't like to use for women, but like a powerhouse. And she immediately became the center in Boston. Also, well, because of her character, but also because she immigrated quite early. So she was able to set up there, start working, and then many other women joined her in Boston, but she was there in the center already. She was already established. So a lot of different factors. I think a factor also that's important is when someone died. People like Helene Deutsch, she lived for 99 years. And so she lived up, she died in 82. So or 82. So she lived for 98 years, sorry. So she lived so long so that she was interviewed. Like, the research I'm doing here in the US is really rewarding because that's very different from Poland, which was, you know, completely devastated by the war. And then, you know, the effort of rebuilding after the war. And then there was communism there too. So no one focused on something that they focus here in America, which was preserving the documents. And then, so there's so many documents here in scattered around different archives, but they are here. Like the people who brought them here usually kept them, sometimes in their drawers, but sometimes donated them. Sometimes their children or grandchildren donated them to archives, and so they were preserved here. I lost the train of thought. Oh, I know. But what I want to say is those who lived so in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, there were a lot of projects here, oral history projects. A lot of interviews were being conducted. So those who lived to those years and were interviewed, that's another way of not being forgotten. I'm now writing a book, which I'm really excited about Klara Happel, one of the first generation psychoanalysts. She died in 1945, and she was one of the most important psychoanalysts in Europe before the war. I think she's completely forgotten, also because she died in 1945, very, very early, before anyone thought of interviewing her. Even though she did leave some writings. But I think it's just, like in the case of Sabina Spielrein, it's the fact that she died in 1942 in the war. It's the fact that she was not acknowledged by so many important psychoanalysts like Freud, Jung, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, and the list is much, much longer. For example, in case of Eugenia Sokolnicka, who was the first psychoanalyst in France, and so I'm going to say at the end maybe about the book if you're interested. But so she was the first psychoanalyst in France, but she wasn't liked by Freud. Freud didn't like her. We know this from his correspondence with I think Ferenczi. He writes about how, well, he doesn't really like her, like, eh. So, but he liked Marie Bonaparte. So Marie Bonaparte.
He liked Ellen Deutsch a lot.
He liked, yeah, you're right. He liked Helen George a lot too. Favorism, we can call it, right? But so he pushes. So he never officially said, Eugenia Sokolnicka is my representative in France. He liked that she went there because he wanted to spread psychoanalysis, but he never said she's my official envoy, right? She's my representative. But he did say this for Marie Bonaparte. And here, the fact that Eugenia Sokolnicka was not a medical doctor also worked to her disadvantage. So Marie Bonaparte goes to Paris and she completely substitutes Sokolnicka. Sokolnicka ends up committing suicide in poverty, completely forgotten, even though she was the first one. And she did so much work there to bring psychoanalysis to France. So I think so many different factors work toward this. I think what I'm interested in, so I'm not a psychoanalyst, and as and I'm not really interested in theories that much, but I'm interested in things like friendships, the meaning of friendship. And that's what I find with those emigres, that it was really important if they were part of a community. So those who immigrated to New York, and about 50%, a little bit over 50% of those who went to the US immigrated to New York, had it easier, to be honest. Like if they had friendships, if they were part of a Jewish community, immigrant community, German-speaking community, it was easier for them. They had that support and that helped with their careers, and that in some cases help with being remembered. Those like Klara Happel, who went to places like Detroit to spread psychoanalysis there, were lonely, isolated, didn't have that support. Their lives that was a different path for them. So I think it's a very complex, it's a great question, but I think it's very complex. There are some trends, but I think there's also individual stories. I also find, like, when I was trying to track down some of those women, so I would, going back to what I told you at the very, very beginning, when I started putting this list together, so I would read someone's memoir, and there was a name mentioned in the memoir, like, for example, like, so on the ship to the US, there was also, you know, whatever her name was. I would try to track down that person. If they were married to psychoanalysts or men who became somehow famous, it was easier, which of course was driving me crazy, to track them down, because through, you know, the famous husband, like to see where she went, where she settled, because she would be mentioned in a footnote to her husband's story, or her husband maybe wrote a memoir or something, you know, or had some correspondence on something. And of course, those who are mentioned in the correspondence between Freud and Jung, Ferenczi, and all those others, and there's a vast correspondence, that was easier for me to track down, and also had a higher chance of not being completely omitted from history. I forgot what your second question is. I was connected, but sorry, I took for too long.
About the attempt of this psychoanalyst of disconnect from their past. And I asked if it was a characteristic of the Nazi refugees in general.
I think so. I think it was. I mean, that's a generalization, of course, because, you know, there were separate cases of different cases, but I think that was a general approach, a general trend, and to not talk about the past. And in mental health professionals, in other emigres to the US and elsewhere, just to forget. I know it from personal experience. My parents, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. No one ever talked about that. My father never talked about that. That was something omitted. And these are the stories I know from my friends too, who have a similar family history. It was just the approach and the whole, again, a generalization, but like I said, like this new, that was the approach of therapists, and, you know, don't talk about this. So they would discourage their patients of talking about this too. It was believed that that's the right approach to just forget. Yeah. So I think so. I think that it was a general approach.
Did Kestenberg use the term intergenerational transmission of trauma? Did she use this term?
I can't remember if she used that. Sorry, I can't remember. Definitely not in the first text, but I can't remember if she used that at all. I can't remember. Sorry. But she definitely described it.
Richard, pode, acho que abrir para pergunta, né?
Sim, gente, quem quiser fazer
questões
agora, pode. Quem quiser fazer questões agora, pode colocar. And Klara, before, I'm going to wait a little while if people have questions to ask. Let me see. Juliana mentioned that she's interested in the book you mentioned about Sokolnika, and she wanted the reference. You mentioned a book about Sokolnika.
Yes.
What is the book?
So the book I meant is the book you are contributing to, actually.
Oh, okay.
So we had a conference on Sabina Spielrein and the first female psychoanalysts, where both Fátima and Richard contributed. And now I'm editing a book with, I think we have 13 chapters on 13 female psychoanalysts, early female psychoanalysts. And one of the chapters is about Sokolnicka and Sophie Morgenstern, the two Polish Jewish women who immigrated to Paris. Morgenstern was Sokolnicka's analysant initially. They both had very tragic lives. But so that's the book I'm editing now, working on now, and it is scheduled to come out next year in the fall, and it will be published by Routledge Press. So that's something that's happening, and that's very exciting. Very happy about that. So I can share more information with Richard, and then you can pass it on. I don't know if that's possible, but when we know more.
Yeah, sure. There's another. It's not particularly a question; it's a comment. Jose Alonso says that's such an important research. Maybe the reason why we don't have more women in psychoanalysis is just the fact that they were not actually listened. Do you think that the fact that the history of women psychoanalysis is much less well known than the male psychoanalysis is a reason for there are fewer women psychoanalysts now than male psychoanalysts?
That there are now fewer women psychoanalysts than men psychoanalysts? I
think this is the spirit of the comment I just read.
I don't know if that's true. My guess would be that
I believe that it's the opposite. There are more female psychoanalysts. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I'd say that too. I mean, that completely, I guess, because I have no idea what the statistics are, but my guess would be that. And that was the case before the war too. I mean, obviously starting with 0 women. For example, in the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, it starts initially the Wednesday Society, the Freud group starts with 0 women. But at the end, so in 1938, I think 40 or 45% were women. And for example, out of the emigres to the US, 1930s, 1940s, more than half were women. Over 50% were women. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry. Because you said something about that they were not listened to, but I'm not sure in what way, because for sure they weren't listened to, but I'm not sure what you mean. Like listen to what, where?
Okay.
Did you find in your research some psychoanalysts who came to Brazil fleeing Nazism?
I can't remember because I was, I'm focused on those who went to the US. So when I was looking at, I would see that someone went elsewhere. I wouldn't put that person on the list. So I can't remember. The
only one I know.
There is Anna Richard, Anna. I don't remember.
No, the only one I know is Adelaide Koch, which came from Vienna. Mm-hmm. She was also from a Jewish family, and and she came to Brazil, and then she became the first training analyst here in the Brazilian Psychoanalytical Society, because before that people had to travel abroad to get their training analysis. So she was at least she was the first officially acknowledged training analyst in the Brazilian, and she also immigrated from Vienna, and she was also Jewish.
I remember reading that there were a lot of immigrants to South America. I think, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, Renata, but maybe you know?
You're muted.
Sorry, I was writing a question for you. I didn't hear. What was your question?
It was about women analysts who immigrated to Brazil, if you know any names, if you know about any.
No, not yet. Maybe we can research after your so beautiful research. I think you give us methodology for doing a research like that about
Thank you.
immigration of women analysts from Europe. I don't know anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but I believe maybe many women who came to South America ended up in Argentina, not Brazil, because psychoanalysis was already more strongly developed in Argentina at the time. And it also have a strong Jewish community there. So I think in the 1930s, 1940s, I believe the psychoanalysis was just beginning in Brazil at the time. And so I think maybe, I'm not sure, so I'm not research, but I believe many immigrants ended up in Argentina and not in Brazil.
Yes, I think so. In Argentine, maybe we will find them.
Let me see, there's more question. There are a couple of questions. I'm going to translate them to you, okay, Klara? Wayne asks, thank you and congratulations for your exposition. Have a question about a methodological curiosity. Your work uses many philosophical concepts, for example, identity, memory, interpretation, among others. So what is your philosophical references or philosophical authors, if you use philosophical ideas, theories or authors in your research, who are the ones, or what are the ones that you are closer and use more often?
I don't think I can name a name like that. I think at the risk of sounding very not modest, I would say this is quite new, what I'm doing, and reaching beyond the official sources where those women are mostly absent from, into personal history, into their accounts, and even history of emotions, oral histories, but I don't really, I can't really name anyone that would be, main inspiration or something like that. I'm kind of following my gut on that. But there are a lot of memory studies that are that I could reference, but if that's of interest, I can send it in later, I would probably say, to not, about identity, I don't think I could name anything. It's yeah.
Okay, thank you. Renata, do you want me to read your question, or do you want to ask it yourself?
Read it. My spoken English may be not so good as yours.
Okay, so Renata asks, Klara, I'm very moved by your lecture and your research. She says how you have broaden your methodology and its application after your research about Sabina Spielheim. I wrote myself in 2010 a paper about the first psychoanalyst, female psychoanalyst, and I came to conclusions about the fact that they have been forgotten, very similar to your own conclusions. I think your research very 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 important in the current times because of the growing of authoritarian governments and regimes around the world, and the presence, the increasing of the number of refugees due to this regime, due to this wars and other tragedies related to the emergence of these regimes. So she said, congratulations. Renata, I didn't understand the last sentence of your question. I think that's
yes. I said, I hope you can bring back and tell us more about your research, about the other women you research.
Wait, sorry. That's like now more about my research. Is that what you're asking? Sorry, or is it like
other lectures?
Okay, yes, I wasn't sure.
Fátima can bring you back for more lectures about such a moving research.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I'm sure I would love to. Yeah. I have some papers coming out too, and chapters in the book this year and next year. I could send out some information about that, and I can send you some links to the lectures I gave in the past too. If I don't know if you have like a mailing list, Richard, that we could share things.
Yeah, of course, you can send me. We have some mailing lists. We can spread the information.
Okay, so I can do that. And there was a question about the philosophical inspiration, which kind of now I'm thinking about that. So I can send out some things that are probably most important. Like I think the memory studies, that would be the main. So I could follow up with all of that.
Okay, it would be really great. I have one more question. Let me find it again. It's from Masayoshi. The question is, dear Klara, I was very interested in your lucid lecture. I think there are still many outstanding Jewish women psychotherapists buried in history. I hope you will continue to dig them up. The fundamental idea underlying Jewish thought that the individual is not complete on his or her own, that is, that the person is constituted in a responsive relationship between people and God who calls on each person, seems to have produced a psychology that differs from the world and human views based on scientific rationalism. Inevitably, the existence of the other is an integral part of a person. The workings of the mind that portrays the other as an image all over seem to be common in Jewish thought. It's midnight in Kyoto, where it will soon be Sunday. I will leave you here. I hope for another opportunity. Best regards, Masayoshi Morioka. So this was the comment you were to say something about it.
Well, I think all I can say that's a very important comment, and I think that's those questions about why I think that comment kind of relates to the question about why there were so many women getting into psychoanalysis, for example, and how is, well, and also even actually going back, what is the connection between Jewish culture that I understood as Ashkenazi culture here and psychoanalysis? Why is psychoanalysis the so-called Jewish science, as both Freud and Hitler called it? But I think that's an enormous question, but I think that's what she said kind of is the beginning of answering it. What is there in the Jewish culture that that contributed to the fact that psychotherapy, I would even say, it has the Jewish roots? Like, is that's something I'm also writing a little bit about today, actually, because here in America, it's believed that actually the roots of psychotherapy are white. And I mean, by white, I mean white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And the Jews are kind of thrown into this white culture, but Jewish culture is not part of white culture understood as WASP culture at all. And the roots of psychotherapy are actually Jewish. Anyway, there's a huge, like, we could open up like a huge discussion here, but what are the reasons for behind the fact that psychotherapy has those Jewish roots, and how, what are the ethics of the Jewish culture of that, I would say, are about contributing to the community, being part of a community that is a duty, and that's also in Kestenberg's case. We see it in the philanthropy of her father, and those Jews, there's wealthy Jewish families that have been researching the families of female psychoanalysts that were very wealthy. They were very often volunteering and in many different help organizations. And then there's this openness to, I would say, to looking inside. And there's this idea that we are good, while I think in the WASP culture, there's this sin. And anyway, that's like a huge question. I mean, that she opened up, but I think it's really interesting why the Jewish culture overlaps with psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and I think what she said is very, very true about those ideals of Judaism and Jewish culture that contributed to that. That's a comment I can make for now. It's a huge issue, but very interesting, I think.
Okay, there's another it's not properly a question, it's more a comment, and it's from Deborah Barmak. She says, hello, Klara. I'm Deborah Barmak, coordinator of the Oral History Department in the Jewish Museum of São Paulo in Brazil. Congratulations for your lecture. I found your research about Jewish women, mental professionals in the early 19th century, I think it's the 20th century, extremely interesting. So I would like, if possible, to have your contact to eventually have a similar online lecture in the museum, in the Jewish Museum of São Paulo. So Deborah left her email on the chat, and she asked if she can have your contact. So if you can just write your email.
Thank you so much. I would love to. I can actually. I'm gonna. Wait, how do I do this to say everyone? I'm going to type in my email. So if anyone is interested in, I don't know, asking a follow-up question, there it is in the chat. Please email me, or if you if there was not enough time to ask a question or something comes up, I mean, if if you're also interested in, inviting me to talk or something, just please email me and I'd be happy to connect and answer all the questions that might come up and share information. Thank you, Deborah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question because our time runs out. Someone wants to ask one last question. Now it's the time.
Você quer fazer uma pergunta, Rich?
No, I had one. I'm going to ask one quick question. Just a curiosity, because you said that Kestenberg was atypical because she came from an observant Jewish family, not from a secular Jewish family. And so we are used to relate psychoanalysis to secular Jews. The psychoanalysis is usually regarded as one late product of this important figure in European modern history, that is the secular Jew, the Jew no longer Orthodox, but keeps his or her cultural, historical identity. From Spinoza to Freud, we have this important figure in European modern history. But Kestenberg came from an observant family, and there's also some doubt if she remained observant or not, as you explained, to what degree she remained connected to the, not only to Jewish identity and culture in culture and history, but also to Judaism as a religion. And I'm curious about, because this seems unusual. Freud came from an observant family, but he wasn't observant. He became a godless Jew, and he titled himself. What do you think? There's some impact of this exceptional circumstance on the work of Judith Kestenberg. It represented something that make that the kind of choices she made, the kind of work she chose to do with Holocaust survivors, children, and so forth. Let's just say this peculiar Jewishness of hers had some impact on this.
Well, I really briefly mentioned it before, that I do think that it was connected. I also want to say quickly that in those 22 years of her latency period of this silence, she was working very hard, and she has a lot of publications from different subjects. This was a short presentation. I still exceeded the time limit, but so I didn't have the time to mention this, but she worked on different issues like the Kestenberg movement profile. That's something she's, I think, most famous for at the moment. This is I don't know if it's a form of therapy or approach that is still exists. And Janka Kormos, a colleague of mine, she wrote a great article about it that's accessible online if you want to look it up. But also, if you type it in, they have a website and there's information there too. She also wrote about issues that were very ahead of her time, like the female sexuality and the connection between mothers and daughters and things like this. Is very, very important. But that's just like I just wanted to do her justice and mention that she worked on that too. But I think that her Orthodox roots, her upbringing, and the fact that she preserved that Jewish identity, whether it was religious to some point or just cultural and historical, but she did preserve it. She her son had the bar mitzvah and she attended the synagogue and so on and so on. And I think I would say that there must be a connection just like logically thinking, because if there were only 2 women out of this whole group of 87 who worked with something connected with the Holocaust, who worked with Holocaust survivors and the traumas of the Holocaust, and they both came from Orthodox families. One of them is Kestenberg. I would say there must be a connection, but I can prove it. You know, I can. There's no way of proving it, but I would say that my guess would be that it's less Judaism and more that she had a Jewish identity. That it was throughout her entire life, it was important to her that she was Jewish. And in the case of the other women I researched, and by the way, I haven't researched all of the 87, so there might be some surprises there. You know, I still have a lot of work to do. It's a work in progress. But from what I've found out so far, those other women did not preserve that identity. It was not important to them that they were Jewish. Even though, of course, their lives were impacted so much by the fact that they were Jewish, starting with the fact that they would usually flee persecution. Some of them were put in prisons and so on. So they did the anti-Semitic violence did affect them. Many of them lost their parents, grandparents in the Holocaust or during the war, but they would still not identify as Jewish. They would just say, no, I'm not even Jewish. And many of them would completely deny that. Like, for example, Jenny Valder Hall, really interesting story too, but she was someone who, Polish Jew. She would say, I'm not Polish, I'm not Jewish. She would pretend she doesn't know the Polish language. When her sister would talk to her about something that had to do with the fact that their family was Jewish, she would say, no. Like she, you know, in a cafe, she would say, lower your voice. I don't want to talk about this. On the ship to the US, she decided that's over. She decided, I'm American now. And then when she moved to Boston, she said, I'm Bostonian. This is my city. This is my country. This is who I am. And as a rule, those women very quickly tried to Americanize, very quickly tried to get citizenships. They usually didn't speak German to their children. So they very often came with very young children. So they wanted to raise those children as Americans, maybe Jewish Americans, but not European Jewish. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to kind of say. So I would say, yes, I would say there must be a connection, must have been a connection between her Jewish identity, strong Jewish identity that she claimed herself that she had her whole life, and the fact that she engaged in that work, which was so unusual for female psychoanalysts as a rule, even female and male.
Well, there's Elizabeth, do you want to ask a question?
I was just wondering, Klara, what you think about this. You know, the more orthodox people like Kestenberg, well, who was brought up in an Orthodox family like Kestenberg, you know, and who retained her Jewish identity and even, you know, participated in her synagogue. You know, when you do that kind of thing, when you attend services, you're very immersed in your ancestors. I mean, it's such an experience of connection, I think, with, you know, everything that came before you, because the language and, you know, all, you're repeating prayers that were repeated, you know, from generation to back in other generations. And so I just wonder whether somehow that may have something to do with this, something to do with maybe a little more receptivity to re-entering, you know, this sphere of knowing about her trauma than, you know, people like Jenny Valder Hall, who was cut off or cut herself.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, I would say so. Yes. You know, also still a guess, but yes, I would say so, that being part of that, well, everything you said, it's so spot on, that being part of that would connect her more to the past, to her family, to her ancestors, to what being Jewish meant in history, throughout history. Yeah, I think so, yes.
Ok.
Tem comentário no chat, Richard. Lê para...
Let me see.
Barton Binder.
It's just a goodbye. Klara, thank you so much for your dedication and scholarship. We must go to a meeting now. We stay in communication. Cordially, Bart Blinder. It's just a goodbye. Okay, people, I'm afraid we run out of time. So we need another panel this afternoon. So I would like once more to thank Klara. Thank you very, very much for it's an amazing lecture. We're very pleased to hear from you. We actually hope to hear from you more often. I think many people here also hope. I just want to make an announcement in Portuguese, because actually ending this meeting. Gente, agora à tarde, então, a gente tem a última mesa do nosso evento, que vai ser então a discussão sobre o texto, o livro que eu editei, que eu publiquei recentemente, sobre um curso que o Bento Prado Júnior deu sobre Hegel e Lacan, tá? Então vai ser essa tarde, às 14h, junto com o Daniel, o Christian e o Vladimir, tá ok? Então, só lembrando todo mundo e convidando o pessoal para a mesa de hoje à tarde.
Thank you very much, Klara. Pode falar, Richard.
Say what you want to say.
No, thank you indeed, Klara. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.